TLB.
All right. Red McDaniel interview, 9:24, take 1, second sticks.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, first of all, so much for not only helping us and joining us today, but your enormous service to our nation and to all of us. I sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, have utmost respect for you. And the other thing I want to say that I know that you understand, and when Colonel Athens first approached me about the possibility of this project, and in all the work I put in subsequent to that, I feel that, well, first of all, one of the things, all of you have been interviewed many, many times, and people have sought various aspects of your story and for various reasons. What makes this project unique is that it is for the leaders, the military leaders of tomorrow. What happened in the Hanoi prison systems was a crucible of not only good leadership, but good followership, of men united almost 100% by a common ideal, a common value, and a common spirit. And as you know, the testing that the Navy has done on all of you, the metrics are stunning. You know, your incidence of PTSD in your group is under 4%, and the control group is over 40%. You are healthier, more well-adjusted, happier people today than those who did not go through this horrific experience. Understanding that, learning from that, is important for our military leaders of tomorrow, and that's what this project is for. It's called Return with Honor, because that's what you did and you inspired us with. But something else I want to say that I know that you understand is that I truly believe this project is being guided by the hand of God. That there is a spiritual aspect and a gift in this, that if we allow ourselves to share our stories, we have no idea who this will affect. There are lots of young warriors returning from Afghanistan, Iraq, other places who are struggling today. And I think that the lessons that you learned in Hanoi Hilton can help them. So thank you.
Good, thank you, Patrick.
Yeah. To begin with, just so that we have always a biographical moment to edit back into, just give me a brief sketch of the event that took you down, your incarceration, perhaps times you spent at various parts of the Hanoi prison system, just a brief chronology of your experience there.
I was flying off USS Enterprise on my 81st mission and shot down on a raid downtown Hanoi called Little Detroit. Shot down, captured the second day, sustained a couple of fractured vertebrae on my ejection after fall from a tree. Captured the second day, taken to Hanoi, where I underwent 2 weeks of torture for military information, which I didn't have. And then I moved in with a young man, Lieutenant J.G. Bill Metzger, who was more severely wounded. They moved me in to take care of him because his wounds were life-threatening and mine were not. And he had been lying on a concrete slab for about 2 weeks and was to stay that way for 3 months, no clothes. His left arm ripped open from the wrist to the elbow. The bone was exposed. Left leg had a wound some 16 inches long, about 4 inches deep, where a 4-pound piece of shrapnel had been embedded. And his right leg was broken, and it healed 3 inches overlap. But after seeing him, I quit feeling sorry for myself because he was really in dire straits. And I lived with him for the next 3 years. But he too came home with me in 1973 in excellent health, testifying to God's great healing power. So I moved, I think, 15 times within 5 different locations within the system. And my thing was not as a communicator, but was finding of ways to communicate. And I was always very active in doing that. And it turned out to be my downfall in 1969, was the communication systems that I had established. After some 20 men were tortured very brutally, But that was my big thing, is because I think you have to communicate to live. That was a lifeline in Hanoi. And but I
Go into some of the detail. Your quarters were central, sir, to the communication network.
well, I think in October of 1968, I moved to the Zoo Annex. Moved in with two other guys, Bill Metzger, a fellow by the name of Tom Sterling, and a fellow Air Force pilot, Bill, I can't think of his name right now, from Texas. Moved into a four-man room, and the Zoo Annex had four different buildings, 2 rooms in each building, and each room housed 4 people. But it joined the zoo, which was next door, with about a 16-foot wall, and that was the zoo was the camp where some 150 men lived. And they moved me from the Zoo Annex after about 3 months to the zoo, and to the only cell that had an opening to the Zoo Annex. And it was through that vent, about 12 by 4 feet, 10 feet off the floor. So to communicate, you had to stand on somebody's shoulders to communicate. And we got the attention of the people in my former room by flashing a ball up and down and flashing through that opening until we got somebody to listen to us. And finally, they answered back, and they flashed their door, and we started communication vent to door, and we were able to collect 69 walls. We could get a question through 69 walls and back within 24 hours. And we connected 220 prisoners in doing that. And that was our lifeline. And then we had the escape in 1969. And all the communications between the 2 camps went through our vent, through our room. And they planned to escape in the Zoo Annex without telling the zoo where I lived, because they felt the senior officer would not approve of this attempt. So they decided to keep it in-house. So they planned the escape, looking for a rainy Saturday night, because when it rained, the lights were short out. A Saturday night, because they had a late bed check on Sunday, about 7 o'clock rather than 5:30, Monday through Saturday. And they got the rainy Saturday night, May 10th, 1969, went out of the overhead, which was about 18 feet above a concrete slab, down the wall of the cell, over the outer perimeter wall that was 22 feet tall, that had shards of glass, concertina wire that was charged. But when it rained, the lights would short out. And that's why the rainy Saturday night. The lights would short out, and they went over the outer wall and downtown and got into the river, and had planned to get into the river and float about 150 miles to the coast, High Falling, the second major city. But after the escape attempt occurred, some 20 men were tortured very brutally over the next 6 weeks. And after the escape attempt, which occurred May 10th, they didn't come to my cell until June 16th. Some 6 weeks after that, after some 20 men had been tortured very brutally, and when you don't have the right answers, you make up answers. So I was in an impossible situation. I had to confirm all that had been told on the previous 6 weeks of heavy torture, which is an impossible task, because the answers they wanted I didn't have. And that's why my torture, until this day, I still think they feel I have the right answers, but I did not have them. Had I had them, at some point they would have gotten them, but I didn't have them, so. And that was why my torture was so severe, was because I didn't have the answers they were looking for. Because the enemy had the ability to get whatever they wanted. It might take 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, but they had the means to do it, and they used it frequently, and could get anything they wanted at some point.
You're also being a bit modest, sir. You also, I believe, acted to protect a younger officer who you felt was...
Well, yes, we had a young fellow, J.J. Connell, a young lieutenant, who shot down about a year before I was, and he feigned injuries from the initial torture, because most people, after torture, lost the use of their hands for maybe 6 or 8 months, because they tie your arms behind your back, put an arm around you, bring your elbows together, and stop the circulation from going down into the hands. And they do that for about 30 minutes, and then at the end of 30 minutes, they release the ropes, the blood flows in, creating a pain they're trying to create. And in doing that, you come out with some dangling hands. And J.J. Connell pretended he never recovered use of his hands. And they thought he was kind of off his rocker, crazy, and so they put him off into a room by himself, into a coal bin. And from the zoo to that coal bin, we communicated daily with J.J. Connell, who helped us connect the 220 men in the two camps. And we communicated daily with him, and they began to suspect after a year or so that he was feigning the injury, that he was not injured as severely as he was. And so to protect him from that, that was one of my main goals, because he was in a pretty tough situation.
Your courage is extraordinary, sir.
And he disappeared in about 1970. He just the enemy was taking him downtown daily for electric shock treatments to correct his mental condition, and he never pretended not to be crazy. He just went every day to get to the shock treatment, but it was pretty tough on him, and we used to feel real sorry for him. And I think eventually he did go off the deep end, and he disappeared at about 1970, 71, and never was seen again.
The military code of conduct, as you understood it as a warrior taking off from that carrier that day, had very specific requirements of you. In many ways, I look at the story of the Vietnam POWs, and in some ways, maybe now we have enough distance we can look back at Vietnam and understand ourselves better than we could at the time when it was happening. But in some ways, the story of the POWs is the story of America. We assumed we were a kind of John Wayne. We could take any pain, that we could emerge victorious. We had military superiority. And many of the former POWs I've spoken to talk to me about one seminal moment when they eject from their fighter craft and begin to parachute down. And they hear this pop, 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 and realize that they're being shot at by small arms fire. And as Charlie Plum told me, there was a moment when I was like, what do you mean? Don't you understand? I'm an American pilot. You're shooting at me. And there was this shock. And then, the moment you land, the world changes. And the reality on the ground is a different world entirely. And I think in some ways, perhaps not the original draftsmen of the military code of conduct, but certainly those who changed it over time, had an idea about pain and the American servicemen and what we should or should not be able to do. When you and your fellow POWs encountered the harsh realities of the Hanoi prison system, very quickly life on the ground began to change. But you each talk about a seminal moment, and I think one of the most insidious things that the Vietnamese did beyond the torture itself was to break you and then leave you alone in your cells with a shattering feeling. As Reed McCleary said to me, I lay in my cell weeping, thinking I could never return to my country should we ever be freed. I would have to live in South America or Mexico or Canada, but I could never face my countrymen again. And all of you shared this feeling upon breaking. Talk to me about that moment of failure and how the world of the Hanoi prison system, as all of you pulled together, how it reached out to you and lifted you and changed for you what you thought of yourself and how you helped others in that.
Well, for me, I was shot down on my 81st mission near the end of my combat tour. We had another couple of weeks, probably another 3 or 4 missions, and I would have been coming home, finished with combat. But on May 19th, it was a major escalation point in the war. We were supposed to be in port. In fact, my wife Dorothy had a letter saying that on that day I was in port, so she didn't have to worry about me on May 19th. But we were extended on the line, and we were about 30 miles to the target, and when a missile is coming up and you hear that missile explode, there's nothing, you can't imagine at that moment in time losing everything. Your freedom, your health, family, home, to go home, lose everything in that minute, and it's really a big shock on that. And that's what I felt when I first ejected from my aircraft, and then after that I heard the shooting and continued down, and I realized that the worst was yet to come, because I landed in a tree and I fell about 30, 40 feet from the tree to the ground, crushed two vertebrae in my back, and was partially paralyzed. So it went from bad to worse. But there's no feeling like losing everything in that brief moment. And then, but I did have kind of a sense of relief on the ground. I felt that I was through flying combat, because I had partially paralyzed condition. I wouldn't have to fly any more combat. And I was kind of relieved about that. And then I got to prison, and of course I underwent 2 weeks of torture, which they force you to do things. And fortunately we didn't have a lot of intelligence. Had we had it, we would have given it to them, but we didn't have it. They kept intelligence away from the flight crews that were going to fly the missions the next day, especially on alpha strikes. And but when you go through the torture, there comes a moment where you have we as Americans can rise above any situation just by laughing about it for a few seconds. We have a sense of humor. The enemy didn't have that. And I remember in my first bath in 1967, in the Heartbreak Hotel, there was a rusty pipe, no shower head, just a handle to turn it on and off, and they had a little stool by the shower. And as I looked at the shower, right at eye level, somebody had written "smile you" on candid camera, and that gave me a little boost for a second. But I got my bath, went back to my cell, and I think it's at that point you begin that reality really sets in, that you have betrayed your country. You have given them more than you expected to give. But I contended throughout my initial interrogation that I was not an A6 pilot. I had flown an A1 Skyraider early in my career, and I told the enemy that I was flying an A1 Skyraider, where I was really flying the A6. And I'm sure they didn't believe me, but I stuck with that story throughout. But in that process, you begin to realize that you're a lot weaker than you thought you were going to be. Because the enemy, they've got methods of getting whatever they want, and it might take a day, a week, a month, a year, but they had them and they used it frequently on most of us.
It seems that the Vietnamese had a systematic program of humiliation. They wanted you to bow. They wanted you to give up things under torture that were not constitutionally part of how you thought about the world or anything else. In all of you that I've met, I encounter a remarkable humility, a strength and yet a humility. And somewhere in that crucible of that experience, humiliation became humility, which led to strength. Can you talk to me about that process? What was it for you?
Well, they have a way of humbling you, and they can break any man. There's no Iron Man in that environment, and using the methods they used on us. So there's no Iron Man. So they had the ability to get to anybody that they wanted to over. What you try to do as an individual is to be a little tougher than your next guy, so they get it from him, not you. But they're going to get what they want from somebody eventually, and it's a very humbling experience to have that, have that happen, because when you're flying state-of-the-art aircraft, you're above reproach. You think you're macho man, but you find out that isn't true, that everybody has a breaking point. And the enemy could get to that point.
One of the things that is spoken about is in the Hanoi prison systems is the remarkable leadership. How did you experience the leadership? And tell me in ways that you remember, and you can do it anecdotally through stories, in ways in which that helped you.
Well, the leadership, it's loyalty up the chain of command and down the chain of command. And we had strong leadership from the top, and everybody knew who was senior to who. We had a way of knowing we had primarily Air Force, Navy. And so we took the best of the Air Force, flights, wing commander, and the best of the Navy, which is COXO, and combined the two. So we had a flight and an air wing with CO and XO. And we had a very strong chain of command, and we had a great leadership. Jim Stockdale, Admiral Jeremiah Denton, Billy Lawrence, Bob Shoemaker, and people like that who were there a long time were just strong leaders. And I was about the 200th pilot shot down, so they had a pretty strong system when I got there. And I got there and moved in with a couple of men, and I was in the treatment for the most part was isolation, 1 or 2 men per cell. But after they began to get 250, 300 prisoners, they didn't have individual cells. They moved us together in larger numbers, maybe 3 or 4 per cell. And then after the Sante raid in 1970, where the 6 helicopters came in from Laos to rescue Camp Faith that had 72 men. But when they got there, the men had been moved. They left without incident. But after that, they moved us all downtown on November the 24th, 1970, into the Hanoi Hilton, where we moved into large cell blocks. They had about 6 cells, because at that time they had around 250 men, I think. And I moved in with 57 men into a cell block about 40 by 50 feet, and we divided it up 57 ways, and we had 22 inches by 6 feet per man for the next 3 years. But we gained strength moving together like that, because we didn't have to communicate through the walls for conversation. You could talk to the guy you were sleeping next to, and that was a real boost for us. And one of the first things that we did as a group, though, this is interesting, is to press for the right to have a church service. It had been denied us all those years. And we started singing songs at the top of our voice. For 2.5 days, we sang songs like God Bless America, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But it doesn't take aviators long to run out of those kind of songs. So we started singing fraternity songs. And at the end of 2.5 days, the enemy came with 100 well-armed soldiers and took 60 of our senior officers out of those cell blocks and placed them in solitary confinement, where they stayed until we came home in 1973. But we gained the right to have a 10-minute worship service every Sunday with a 4-man choir. And so I ask you these questions. Why do you think a group of men risked torture just to gain the privilege of worshiping freely, as we did?
Patrick, I would get him to elaborate on the leadership up and down the chain of command. This would be something good for the future leaders. Talk about what you learned in captivity about the respect for leadership up and down the chain of command, and how you took that when you commanded your ships and knew every sailor's name. That would be important for these ships to hear.
Yes, it's just very important. Loyalty works both ways, and we had that. We knew our leaders, and the leaders respected us down the chain of command. But what do you do we had of the 450 men for the most part in my system. If you, they all had, most of them were young JOs, 10 years my junior. How do you harness a group like that who want to storm the walls, want to escape? You have to kind of really, it takes strong leadership to do that, but we had that in Stockdale, Denton, and General Robinson Reisner, who was an Air Force ace before he was shot down, and one of our great leaders. So we had just had great leadership, and that leadership encouraged us. I was kind of a mid-grade officer, a lieutenant commander, but we had a lot of younger JOs. And Mike, what was the other point?
I would talk about the importance of the respect you give for the men under you, and the importance of knowing their names.
Oh, yes, yes. That carried over to my Accra Cura. I had about 2,500 men. My job on that ship was to know every man by name. I had a smaller ship, around 600 men, than an aircraft carrier, and my job was to learn every man by name. And as I passed those men on the ship, I would acknowledge them by name. And if they didn't salute me, I'd salute them. And I spent my time on both ships, was going around the ship, finding out what was done in that space the day before and the day before that. And even though they knew I didn't see them do it, the fact I was aware they did it was very important to them. So, and on my carrier, 1978, the average age of my crew was 19 years and 2 months.
And you accredit this way of thinking with lessons you learned?
Yes, lesson learned in captivity, absolutely, because I know a man's name is his most important asset. And if you know his name, your point's up with him. It takes you a long ways with him. So I made that effort on my ships to learn their names and to call them by name when I met with them.
As an example, my understanding is when a new shutdown would arrive in the system, the first impulse by all of you was to learn this person's identity. What is your name?
Yes, yes.
And then the next question is, what is your rank?
Right, right.
Demonstrating two fundamental aspects, one very human, which is what you say, when you have a name, you have a self. And the other one is that you were a military organization, and where this person fell in the chain of leadership was really important to establish up front. Can you speak to that?
Yes, we did. We knew who was senior to who, and because we knew you had to have absolute strong leadership to survive that environment. And it's really hard for the senior officers to keep young JOs in tow because you have nothing to offer. You can't give them a week's liberty. You can't give them time off. All you can do is just keep them from storming the walls. And so the leadership, you cannot underestimate the leadership of our senior officers in that environment. It really took that, and it was, without that, we would not have survived.
Would you also make the point, as one Marine said to me recently, that the Hanoi prison system was not only an example of excellent leadership, it was an example of excellent followership. That those junior officers who carried out the instructions and that everyone was joined in one mind.
Oh, yes. And in a strong chain of command.
Yes, yeah.
And that was our livelihood.
Yeah. And at a certain point, what your battle behind bars became, you speak about winning the war inside. Your battle of resistance, ultimately you weren't going to change the war. Ultimately you weren't taking out military targets, but you resisted on a daily basis. Interestingly enough, the Vietnamese, coming from a communist system, felt it was very, very important to indoctrinate you, to bring you over to their point of view. In America, that wouldn't even occur to us. If we captured an enemy prisoner, parading that prisoner, having that prisoner saying America is great, wouldn't even occur to us because we know America's great, and you know, it's not even in our way of thinking. So even in their need for you to become an instrument of propaganda, they demonstrated a kind of insecurity, a kind of defensiveness. And when you decided, and what's remarkable about all of you is that you did this on your own, whether you were part of it, even when you were in isolation, you decided to resist. You decided to fight. What do you think is the source of that? I mean, in one, it's partly because you were all military men and you thought that way. In part, it was also you were American and your sense of freedom was important to you. And so you fought because they were incarcerating and taking that away. Speak to me about those motivations in the solitude and the loneliness that first sparked you before you were part of the entire group.
Well, my motivation was to get out of there. And I was an athlete in high school and college, and I believe to win in sports, you have to have a positive attitude, believing you can win. And that carried over into Vietnam, into a captive environment. You have to think you could survive to survive. And I had absolute blind faith that someday, some way, I was going to get out of that place. And to do that, I turned to the only source of strength that I had. The only source of strength that we had that they can't take from you is your faith. And I had faith before I was shot down, but I was macho man, self-sufficient, needed nothing more, a top pilot, didn't need a lot more. But then when you lose all that, when you lose everything except the breath of life, the one thing you have that they can't take is your faith. And I hung on to that for all those years, and because without a doubt, I knew someday I was going to get out of that place. In fact, I was the camp optimist. When the men would get down in spirit, they'd tap a little signal down the wall and say, "Red, we're going to go home." My goal was 2 months, time and time again. Well, in 6 years, I lost a lot of credibility, but that's what they wanted to hear. They were going to get out of this place. And sure enough, in 1973, it happened.
Every former POW speaks of this metamorphosis, let's call it, of being reduced, being humiliated, being shamed, feeling abject, like you had betrayed yourself, your countrymen, and then first through some spark, whether it's a tapping through the wall, a roommate who picks you up and says, "We all fail, let's get up and fight again," whatever it is, there was this first moment, this glimmer of something for those who were religious or spiritual in nature. That was God. For those who might be more philosophical, Stockdale, he called it finding his essential goodness. Others might refer to it other ways, but in a sense, perhaps all we're viewing are the many faces of God in that. Many, many different descriptions, but the same thing. This thing that suddenly in the depths of your humanity, in the depths of loss and despair, you reached out and you found that thing. And that redemptive moment. Now, there's a lot of young soldiers, servicemen and women returning from present-day wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever it is, and finding their readjustment to civilian life perhaps really hard. They're seeking answers to questions that they don't know how to find. What can you say about loss, about failure, about being defeated, and about finding that source of strength in a way that is honest, true, and helped you?
Well, all of us at some point felt we betrayed our country by giving the enemy more than we should have. But in 1969, during my 2 weeks of torture, 7 days, 7 nights without sleep, the period was 5 days without sleep, 5 days, 5 nights. Well, in my case, they pushed me 7 days, 7 nights without sleep, beaten daily with a fan belt, kneeling on pitted concrete 24/7, arms over my head. And at one time, I had 39 open wounds on my body, and I took an inventory of myself, and the only thing I had left was my faith. And I learned a valuable lesson in that torture room that I had not learned up to that point. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is simply the presence of faith. something they can't take away from you. And that was able to carry me throughout the remainder of my 3 years there, and it has served me well coming out. And I think we had very few atheists in the prison cell. A lot of guys would, if you were in a cell with another man or two men, one day the two would be against the other one. Next day the two of you would be against him, or if your cellmate had a different opinion from you, you'd have an opposite opinion. But it was just that's human nature. And we would never bring up anything controversial until after we had our meager meal of pumpkin soup or cabbage soup. And that's when you'd bring up controversial subjects, because if you'd brought it up early, you'd argue about those. But we just learned to exist and learned to respect each other. But I think the common thread was among all of us was a strand of faith that we all had.
Patrick, can you talk about, Dad, talk to the soldier he was talking about, the soldier of Marines from Iraq and Afghanistan, about overcoming adversity. That's really part of your message. Overcoming adversity, you're talking to the soldiers that are going to be dealing with this in the years to come. Talk about overcoming adversity. We all go through adversity.
In our lives, adversity comes in many different forms, but it comes in all of our lives at some point in some form. It doesn't have to be a communist prison. It could be a divorce, injury of a child, a death within a family. But when it comes, and it does, and it comes in all of our lives, and you say, well, why does a great God, all-powerful, allow these things to happen? Well, God is simply more concerned about our character than our comfort. When adversity comes, from that adversity we build a character that I can maybe sympathize with you in your troubles or other people in their troubles. And that's why God is more concerned about character than comfort. And we have that so we can be more compassionate for other people. And I think that's, the storms come in many different ways. And I learned very early on that when the storms come, you don't wait for the storms to pass. You just learn how to dance in the rain and get through that adversity and go on to fight again later.
A consistent theme, speaking to all the former POWs, let me tilt down a bit. Sure. Thank you, Ken. No one of the former POWs would say, oh, I'm really glad that I was there and I would love to repeat that experience. But almost all of you have said that you came out better man than you went in.
Well, I have said it's probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because before I was shot down, macho man, had been a good athlete in school, active in my church, a deacon in my church, father of 3 children, but at that time needed nothing more. But for the moment of shoot down, all that's out the window. You have to pick up and begin to build a new life in that prison. And with each day, you did that. And so I had 2,118 days to build on. But each day I got stronger. But the central core of all that was faith. Faith in a great God that gave me the strength and gift from one day to the next.
Beautiful. Red, what is a hero?
What is he?
What is a hero?
A hero, I don't think there are no heroes. There are some people who are tougher than others, some people who, but I don't think any of us consider ourselves heroes. No, we are survivors. And to survive, in some cases 9 years, you've got to have a little something you can hang on to. And for me, it was faith. And I'm sure most men will say that. A few probably consider themselves atheists, but you have a lot fewer atheists here than you had there. Today, most of the men came out with a stronger belief.
first time you heard the phrase "return with honor"? Do you remember?
I think near the end, we were talking about we wanted to return with honor. You know, when you're there, in 2 cases, 9 years, a lot of things happen. And you know, you realize the country was in great turmoil because of the Vietnam War. The men and women who served came back and had to apologize for serving in a losing cause. You realize that within our group, there was something that we could offer. We could kind of bring the nation together, and the nation rallied around us, and we received all the adulation that those 3 million men and women who served did not get. So that we were very fortunate, and we received a lot more than we deserved. But I think we were prepared for that, because in our prison, we had probably the most well-educated prisoners ever housed in any prison in the world, because we had 85% college graduates. We had 3 men who had screened for astronaut program. We had 15% had advanced degrees, master's, doctor's degrees. So we had a pretty well-educated group of people there.
Right. Extraordinary, actually. Did your understanding of honor change from the time you were shut down to the time you returned to this country, and following that, as your sense of what the word honor means changed?
No, I don't think so. I think I've always felt that honor had a special place in all of our lives, and I think when you lose your honor, you've lost most of yourself. And so it really didn't change, but I think it did strengthen there. I came out with a lot greater sense of honor than when I went in, but I had it going in too. But it just grew from that experience.
And it seemed like many of the POWs confused being forced to say things as the result of torture they didn't believe in as with betraying their own personal code of honor. But it seemed like you all helped each other re-understand that. Can you speak to that?
Well, you can really, because you realize when you start tapping to the guys through the wall, most guys wanted to withdraw. In fact, a few of them have withdrawn from the group today because of what they did on initial interrogation and initial torture. They caved thinking nobody else did, but most of us did. Most of us had to. And when you realize that, you can kind of pick up the pieces and begin to build a little strength. And I learned that early on, and I was the torture. I think the most severe torture started in early '67 when the war got hot and heavy. And early on, the first few men probably were not tortured initially, but later they went back and tortured them. But I think the guys shot down early on it was a matter of survival. Torture was not a big thing, but in early '70s, they started torturing everybody for military information.
And Red, if you can, tell me about forgiveness, both forgiveness of self and forgiveness of others. What role did it play in unifying you and your fellow former POWs?
Well, I think forgiveness, you have to, if you can't forgive, something's wrong. You have to be able to forgive, because we all are human. We all will err. We all make mistakes. And when you know a man is beaten down, you want to kind of help pick him up and bring him back into the fold and give him a second shot. And that's, I think for the most part, that worked well with us. I think we all wanted to give that guy a second chance, but a lot of the guys kind of withdrew, and we found out if you were out of the communication system that we had for more than 30 days, you went off the deep end. Because for a POW, the most important thing was security. And when you live in a cell for 30 days or longer, you become so secure you don't want to change. And you begin to go off the deep end. You lose touch with reality. But if you communicate daily with the guy next door, he can pick you up and lift you up and help you through the next day. And we learned that early on, and that was, therefore, the lifeline was communications. It kept us going, gave us something to do, and at night sometimes you could put your ear to the wall and it sounded like about 30 secretaries typing away in the office for the communications going. But that was the way we kept going. That was our lifeline.
And it's fair to say then that the communication network was a way that you shared your stories, you shared your grief and your pain and your hopes and dreams. And
Yes, absolutely.
What is the expression "back U.S."? Do you remember? Do you recall when that was?
Back U.S.?
Yes.
I have to think about it a little bit.
If it didn't have a particular meaning to you, we can move on to the next question.
No, I don't. I have to think about it a little bit, I think. But back U.S., but we had a strong, I remember it was a concerted effort among the entire group to back, we knew that we had to back our government because we heard all the bad things over the Hanoi radio about all the riots in the country, the killings in Kent State, and we knew it was absolute that we had to back our country, had to believe that we were there, and therefore the enemy was trying to get us to make a lot of tapes, and most of us didn't make those tapes, and because that's kind of selling out. But you know you have to support your country, you have to believe in your cause to survive. In my case, 6 years.
One of the aspects of back U.S. was the U.S. is obviously stands for the United States, but it was also unity over self.
Yes, unity over self.
And it seems to me that the over 500 of you, for the most part, practiced an extraordinary aspect of that. That the group, the cohesiveness of you came first, and somehow you found identity in that. Can you speak to that, sir? Unity over self.
Unity over self. Well, we felt that the unity of the importance of the group was more important than your individual well-being. And that's where that statement comes from, back U.S., unity before self. In other words, you support the group, and then you support yourself after you support the group. And you have to believe in your cause. And
you found novel ways to occupy your time. What was some of the ways that you did?
I had gone through college almost untouched by education, being an athlete, but there I got serious about studying. I learned some French, German, some Russian, committed to memory some 65 different poems that I'd repeat over and over every day, and it was because you have to stay active, and our major enemy was time and boredom, not torture or not worry of dying of starvation. It was whiling away the minutes, the hours, the days, the weeks, the months, the years, just getting through those, because we had to stretch every minute. Something that we could do within 5 minutes, we would stretch into 2 hours just to while away some time. And I think time was our major enemy.
Change battery in the monitor. Okay, we're gonna change, I'll just let you change that, we'll still keep rolling. Red, do you need to take a little break at all? Use the restroom, get some water?
No, I'm okay if you are.
It's easy to do. We can take a break and then come back and.
Okay, let's just take just a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's cut it.
A couple things.